They called it the worst dirt in the county. 2 acres of solid, unbroken red clay that had sat untouched for 40 years, baking under the Texas sun until the surface cracked into patterns like shattered pottery. The real estate listing had been live for 18 months with 0 inquiries. The price had dropped from $8,000 to $1,200, and still nobody wanted it. When Clara Henderson signed the paperwork on her 28th birthday, the closing attorney actually chuckled. Her older brother, Marcus, who had driven her there in his new Silverado. The truck their father had always promised would be Clara's if she stayed and helped with the family hardware store. Marcus didn't just laugh. He threw his head back and howled. 2 acres of solid clay, he said, wiping his eyes as they stood in the parking lot of the DeWitt County Title Office. Clara, honey, you just paid $1,200 for a giant brick. You can't grow tomatoes on that. You can't grow weeds on that. The only thing that land is good for is maybe a pottery class, and you'd need a jackhammer to dig it up. Clara said nothing. She folded the deed into the back pocket of her jeans. Jeans that had belonged to her mother, faded at the knees. 2 sizes too big since Clara had stopped eating regular meals. And she walked to the passenger side of Marcus's truck. She didn't mention that the $1,200 was all she had left in the world. She didn't mention that when their father died of pancreatic cancer 6 months earlier, the medical bills had swallowed the house, the savings, and the hardware store inventory. She didn't mention that Marcus had taken the life insurance payout, paid off his own credit cards, bought the Silverado, and moved into a rental house in town with his girlfriend, leaving Clara to sleep on the couch of their father's best friend for 3 months, until the friend politely suggested it was time for her to find her own path. The land sat 7 miles outside of Cuero, Texas, down a Kalish road that turned to powder in August and mud in October. When Marcus dropped her off, he didn't even pull onto the property. He stopped on the road, looked out at the 2 acres of rust-colored nothingness, and shook his head. "Call me when you're ready to sell it for $500, he said. "I'll find someone to dump construction debris on it. At least then, it'll be worth something." Clara watched his truck disappear in a cloud of white dust. She stood alone on the edge of her property. Her property? 2 words she kept repeating in her head like a prayer, and felt the August heat pressing down like a physical weight. The clay was hard as concrete. She stomped on it with her boot. It didn't give, not even a crumble. She knelt and pressed her palm against the surface. It was hot enough to burn, smooth in some places, cracked in others, the cracks forming deep crevices that looked like dried riverbeds on a dead planet. She had no plan. That was the truth she admitted only to herself as the sun began to set and the first mosquitoes emerged from the nearby brush. She had no plan, no money, no skills that translated to farming, and no reason to believe that 2 acres of solid clay could become anything other than what everyone already believed it was, a mistake. But she had nowhere else to go, and something about the land's absolute rejection by the world made her feel less alone. If the earth itself could be unwanted and still exist, still hold its ground, then maybe she could too. That night, she slept in the bed of her 1998 Ford Ranger, the truck her father had given her when she turned 16, the truck that now had 287,000 miles and a radiator that leaked if she pushed it past 55. She used a tarp as a tent and her grandmother's quilt as a mattress. The clay was too hard to drive stakes into, so she tied the tarp to the truck's side mirrors and let the other corners flap in the hot wind. She lay on her back and watched the stars emerge. brighter than she'd ever seen them, unobstructed by porch lights or street lamps or the glow of town. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. Another answered. Clara closed her eyes and told herself that tomorrow she would figure out what came next. The first month was humiliation, stacked upon humiliation. She drove into Cuero to use the library's bathroom and Wi-Fi, and at the diner next door, she overheard two men talking about the crazy Henderson girl who'd bought the old Joachim clay pit. They weren't being cruel, exactly. They were being certain. The land had been on the market since before Clara was born. Generations of farmers had looked at it and walked away. The soil composition was 90% Montmorillonite clay, with a plasticity index so high that agricultural extension agents used it as a textbook example of what not to plant in. The water table was supposedly 30 feet down, locked beneath an impermeable layer that laughed at standard wells. The previous owner, a man named Walter Joachim, had tried to grade it for a pasture in the 1980s and broken 3 tractors. He'd died bitter and convinced the land was cursed. Clara learned all of this from Mrs. Patterson at the county records office, who looked at her with the kind of pity usually reserved for stray dogs. She learned it from Dale Kowalski at the Farm Bureau, who refused to even discuss a loan. Miss Henderson, Dale had said, adjusting his glasses and not looking up from her application, which consisted of a handwritten note and a copy of her father's death certificate. You have no collateral. You have no credit history to speak of. You have no farming experience. And you're asking me to finance improvements on 2 acres of solid clay that has been independently assessed as agriculturally worthless by 3 separate soil scientists. I can't help you. I wouldn't help you if I could. You'd be throwing good money after bad, and frankly, I'd feel responsible. She'd nodded and thanked him, and walked out into the October heat. The word worthless followed her home like a stray dog she couldn't shake. Worthless, the same word her brother had used. The same word the realtor had whispered to the closing attorney. The same word she'd started to believe about herself in the dark hours before dawn, when she lay in the truck bed and listened to the tarp snap in the wind and wondered if Marcus was right, if she should just drive back to town, apologize, accept whatever spare room he offered, and admit that some people were simply not meant to build anything. But she didn't. Because on the 32nd morning, something happened that she would later recognize as the first crack in the armor of her despair. It had rained the night before. Not a Texas gully washer, but a slow, steady, persistent rain that had lasted 6 hours. Clara woke to find her tarp sagging in the middle, heavy with collected water. She climbed out of the truck bed, barefoot, and stepped onto the clay. It was slick, not muddy exactly, but glassy, the water sitting on top in thin sheets that reflect the grey morning sky like a mirror. She walked carefully toward the lowest point of the property, a natural depression near the back fence line, where the clay dipped about 3 feet below the surrounding grade. She'd noticed the depression on her first day, but hadn't thought much of it. Now it was filled with water. A shallow pool maybe 10 feet across, the surface perfectly still. She knelt at the edge. The water was not brown. That was the first thing that struck her. Every puddle she'd ever seen in Texas clay turned the color of rust within minutes. But this water was clear, almost blue. She touched it with her fingertip and brought it to her lips without thinking. It was cold, colder than the morning air, colder than it had any right to be after a night of rain in August. Clara sat back on her heels and stared at the pool. The clay around it was the same hard, cracked, ancient red, But the water in the depression was not sitting on top of the clay. It was emerging from it. She could see, now that she looked closely, tiny bubbles rising from hairline fractures in the clay bed. The earth was breathing. The earth was releasing something. She didn't know what it meant. She knew only that for the first time since her father's funeral, she felt something other than grief or shame. She felt curiosity. And curiosity, she would learn, was the first cousin of hope. The next 3 weeks, Clara became a student of clay. She checked out every book the Quero Library had on soil science, hydrology, and Texas geology. She learned that Montmorillonite clay was formed from ancient volcanic ash, that it swelled when wet and shrank when dry, that its impermeability made it valuable for pond liners and landfill seals, but poisonous to root systems. She learned that DeWitt County sat atop the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, one of the largest underground water reservoirs in the United States, but that the aquifer was buried deep beneath layers of clay and rock that made it inaccessible to shallow wells. She also learned, in a dusty textbook she found in the library's discard pile, that some clay deposits acted as natural membranes. That under certain conditions, Artesian pressure could build beneath clay caps, forcing water upward through fractures. That in rare cases, what looked like solid, dead ground was actually a seal, protecting a pressurized system below. Clara read that passage 3 times. Then she drove back to her land and walked every inch of it with a shovel, a pickaxe she'd borrowed from the rancher next door, and a notebook. The neighbor, a man named Royce, who had watched her arrival with the suspicious squint of a man who didn't trust anyone under 50, had lent her the tools with a warning. "That ground will break your back and your spirit," he'd said. "Don't come crying to me when you herniate something." She'd smiled and thanked him, and not mentioned that her spirit had already been broken so thoroughly, she wasn't sure it could be fractured further. For 8 days, she dug. Not deep trenches. She didn't have the strength or the equipment for that, but test holes. 1 foot down. 2 feet. She dug at dawn, before the heat became lethal, and at dusk when the clay cooled enough to touch without blistering her palms. The first 6 holes revealed exactly what everyone expected. More clay. Red, dense, unyielding clay that laughed at her shovel and dulled her pickaxe edge. On the 7th hole, in the lowest part of the depression where the rainwater had pooled, she found something different. 1 foot down, the clay changed color. It was still clay but lighter, tan instead of rust, and it was damp. Not from rain, there hadn't been rain in 4 days, but from below. She dug deeper, her shoulders burning, her hands blistered inside her work gloves. At 2 feet, the tan clay became grey. At 2.5 feet, her shovel struck something that wasn't clay. It was rock. But not the solid limestone she expected. It was fractured, full of veins. And when she pulled the shovel back, water seeped into the hole from the sides. Not a lot, just a trickle. But it was moving upward. Against gravity. Against every law she thought she knew about how water was supposed to behave. Clara sat in the dirt and watched the trickle become a steady flow. Within an hour, the hole was half full of water. By morning, it had overflowed. She dipped her hand into it and tasted it again. It was sweet. Not sweet like sugar, but sweet like stone. Like something that had been filtered through 1,000 years of earth, and had come out clean on the other side. She collected a sample in an old pickle jar and drove it to the Texas A&M Agri-Life Extension office in Victoria, 40 miles away. The hydrologist there, a young woman named Dr. Priya Sharma, who looked at Clara's sunburned face and clay-stained jeans with something that might have been respect, ran tests. She called Clara 3 days later. "Miss Henderson," Dr. Sharma said, her voice careful and precise, "where exactly did you collect this sample?" "From my land, 2 acres off County Road 437. There was a pause. "And you said this water is emerging from a clay deposit?" "Yes, from below it. It's been coming up for almost a week now. The hole I dug is full, it's overflowing." Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Henderson, the total dissolved solids in this sample are remarkably low. The pH is 7.2, which is nearly perfect. The mineral content is exceptional, high in magnesium and potassium, low in sodium. And there's something else. The isotopic signature, sir, suggests this water is very old, possibly thousands of years. It's been trapped beneath an impermeable layer, and you've somehow breached a fracture zone that's allowing it to express." Clara held the phone so tight her hand shook. Is it valuable?" Dr. Sharma laughed. But it wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had just witnessed something impossible. "Miss Henderson, if this is what I think it is, an artesian spring emerging through a natural clay filter, you haven't just found water. You've found some of the purest naturally filtered water in this part of the state. Water like this sells for $4 a bottle in Austin, $5 in Dallas. And if the flow rate is what you're describing, you may have thousands of gallons per day." Clara drove home in a daze. She didn't tell anyone, not yet. She had learned in her 28 years that hope shared too early became fuel for mockery. She would wait, she would verify, she would build. The discovery changed everything, but it didn't change the work. If anything, the work became harder, because now she had something to protect. The spring was fragile. The clay that had sealed it for millennia was now cracked, and if she wasn't careful, she could contaminate the flow or collapse the fracture. She spent a week researching Artesian spring management, reading about Roman aqueducts and French catchment systems and modern spring boxes. She couldn't afford a spring box. She couldn't afford concrete. She couldn't afford much of anything. So she used what she had. She had the clay. She had her hands. She had the Ranger, which she drove to construction sites in Victoria and Quero, asking foremen if she could haul away their discarded materials. She collected broken cinder blocks, scrap lumber, and damaged PVC pipe. She traded 3 days of babysitting for a local rancher's children in exchange for a load of gravel. She scavenged a discarded water tank from behind a dairy farm, cleaned it with bleach she bought with her last $14, and installed it above the spring using a tripod of salvaged telephone poles. By November, she had built a rudimentary catchment system. The spring flowed into a gravel bed she'd constructed by hand. Then, through a filter of sand and charcoal she'd made from burned mesquite. Then into the tank. The overflow ran down a shallow trench she'd dug, inch by inch, day by day, her hands bleeding, her back screaming, into a second, smaller depression she'd expanded into a pond. The clay walls of the pond held the water perfectly. The same impermeability that made the land worthless for farming made it perfect for holding water. She didn't stop there. Because as she worked, she noticed something else. The clay she was digging up, the red Montmorillonite that everyone had dismissed as garbage, had properties she'd never considered. When wet, it became smooth as silk. When dried, it hardened like ceramic. She'd been throwing it into a pile at the edge of her property, a growing mound of excavated earth that Royce, the neighbour, had started calling Clara's Mountain of Mistake. One afternoon, in late November, she was washing her hands in the spring water, scrubbing clay from beneath her fingernails, when she noticed her skin. It was soft, not just clean, but soft in a way it hadn't been since before her father's illness, before the hospital waiting rooms, and the cheap soap and the stress that had aged her 10 years in 6 months. She looked at the clay on her palms. She looked at the water. And she remembered, from one of her library books, that bentonite clay, the very clay beneath her feet, was used in premium skincare products, that it absorbed toxins, that it was mined in Wyoming and sold for hundreds of dollars per ton to cosmetics companies. She drove to Victoria the next day and bought a 50-pound bag of commercially mined bentonite clay from a health food store. She compared it to her own clay, side by side, running tests she'd learned from her books. The plasticity was identical. The mineral content, when she sent samples to Dr. Sharma for informal analysis, was actually superior. Her clay had a higher cation exchange capacity, meaning it could bind more impurities. It was, in the language of the industry, premium grade. Clara stood in the middle of her 2 acres. On Thanksgiving morning, the air sharp and cold, her breath visible in short clouds. The spring was flowing at a steady rate of 2 gallons per minute, filling her tank, feeding her pond, creating a wetland where nothing had grown before. Cattails had emerged at the pond's edge, volunteer plants that had lain dormant for decades, waiting for water. A great blue heron had appeared 2 days earlier, standing motionless in the shallows, watching for frogs. The clay pile was now organized, washed, graded, drying in the sun on wooden pallets she'd salvaged from behind the grocery store. She had not spoken to Marcus in 6 weeks. He had texted once, on her birthday, a message that said, "Hope you're not starving out there. Let me know when you want to sell that brick." She had not responded. She had not told him about the spring. She had not told anyone except Dr. Sharma, who had become a quiet ally, and Royce, who had stopped squinting at her and started bringing her coffee in the mornings. "You're either the stubbornest woman I've ever met," Royce had said last Tuesday, handing her a thermos, "or the smartest. Haven't decided yet." "Maybe both," Clara had replied. By January, the transformation was visible from the road. Where there had been cracked red desert, there was now a system. The spring box, crude but functional, gleamed with water that overflowed in a small waterfall into the pond. The pond, lined with native clay, held 2 feet of clear water that reflected the winter sky. Around it, Clara had planted willow cuttings she'd taken from the Guadalupe River, and they had rooted, their thin branches already reaching toward the water. She'd built a small shed from pallet wood and scrap tin, and inside it she processed clay. She'd learned, from YouTube videos watched on the library's Wi-Fi, how to wash it, screen it, and dry it into a fine powder. She'd made her first batch of soap, spring water and bentonite clay, nothing else, and tested it on her own skin. It was better than anything she'd bought in stores. She started selling at the Cuero Farmers Market in February. She brought 12 bars of soap, wrapped in parchment paper she'd ironed flat and tied with twine. She charged $8 per bar. She sold out in an hour. The next week, she brought 30 bars. She sold out in 2 hours. By March, she had a waiting list. By April, she was making 300 bars a week in her shed, using molds she'd carved from scrap wood, curing them on racks made from discarded fencing. The water came next. She bought 500 glass bottles from a restaurant supply liquidation in San Antonio, washed them in her spring, and filled them by hand. She designed a label on the library computer. Simple, elegant, just the words "Bleeding Earth Spring Water" and an image of a cracked clay pot, with water flowing from the fracture. She charged $6 per 16-ounce bottle. A yoga studio in Austin bought 50 cases. A boutique hotel in Fredericksburg bought 100. a natural grocery chain with locations across Texas, sent a buyer to her property in May, and the buyer, a woman in expensive boots who had clearly expected a hippie commune, stood at the edge of the pond and watched the spring flow and said, "We'll take everything you can produce." Clara didn't say yes immediately. She'd learned caution. She'd learned that every opportunity carried risk. She negotiated. She insisted on keeping her brand name. She demanded a minimum order that would justify hiring help. The buyer agreed, and Clara signed her first distribution contract on the tailgate of her Ranger, using a pen the buyer lent her, because Clara's only pen had run out of ink. By June, 8 months after she'd signed the deed and been laughed out of the title office, Clara Henderson had 3 employees, local women who'd been laid off when the garment factory closed, women who understood what it meant to be told you were worthless. They worked in the shed, which had expanded to 3 sheds, processing clay and bottling water. The spring flowed at a constant rate, tested monthly by Dr. Sharma, certified by the state health department. The clay operation had attracted attention from a cosmetics laboratory in Houston that sent a representative to test samples. The representative, a chemist with 20 years of experience, called Clara 3 days after his visit. "Miss Henderson," he said, and his voice had the same careful wonder that Dr. Sharma's had held 8 months earlier. "Your clay deposit is exceptional. The swelling capacity, the purity, the mineral content. This is pharmaceutical-grade bentonite. We currently import similar material from Wyoming at considerable cost. If you're willing to discuss a mining lease, we can offer you a royalty structure that would guarantee significant annual income." Clara sat on the steps of her shipping container, which was no longer her bedroom. She'd built a small cabin from reclaimed lumber and native stone, with a porch that looked out over the pond, and she did the math. The cosmetics company wanted to pay her $12,000 per month for extraction rights, plus a percentage of processed material sales. The water contract was generating $8,000 per month. The soap and skincare line, which she'd expanded to include clay masks and spring water toners, was bringing in another $4,000 through direct online sales. She was making $24,000 per month on 2 acres of solid clay that her brother had offered $500 for, that the bank had refused to finance, that the entire county had dismissed as a joke. She didn't call Marcus. She didn't call Dale Kowalski at the Farm Bureau. She didn't call the realtor who'd sold her the land with a smirk and a comment about buyer's remorse. She kept working. She expanded the pond into a wetland garden, planting native water lilies and irises that attracted dragonflies and reed-winged blackbirds. She built a greenhouse from salvaged windows and grew watercress in the spring overflow, selling it to restaurants in San Antonio that featured it on menus as bleeding earth greens. She installed solar panels, bought second-hand, that powered the bottling operation and her cabin. She became, gradually, and then suddenly, the owner of something that looked, to anyone driving past County Road 437, like an oasis in a landscape of indifference. The first week of August, exactly 1 year after she'd bought the land, Clara woke to find a Silverado parked at her gate. She was in the greenhouse, harvesting watercress, when she heard the engine. She walked out, wiping her hands on her apron. The same apron her mother had worn in the hardware store. The same faded denim that had somehow survived bankruptcy and grief and transformation. And she found Marcus standing at the fence line, staring at the pond, the sheds, the greenhouse, the solar panels, the sign that read Bleeding Earth Farm in letters she'd painted herself. He looked different, thinner. The girlfriend was gone, Clara learned later, and with her had gone the rental house and the easy money. Marcus had been working at a lumber yard in Victoria, making $14 an hour, and he'd heard about his sister's operation from a co-worker who'd seen a feature about her in the Victoria Advocate. "Clara," he said. He didn't laugh. He didn't howl. He looked at the water flowing from the spring box, at the heron standing in the pond, at the clay drying on pallets in the sun, and he looked small. "I didn't know. I heard, but I didn't know." Clara leaned against the fence. She felt no anger. That was the surprise. She'd expected, in her darker moments, to feel vindictive, to want to throw his words back at him, to say, "Who's laughing now?" But standing there, with the sun on her face and the sound of water moving through earth that everyone had called dead, she felt only a deep, quiet satisfaction. "I didn't know either," she said, not at first. Marcus shuffled his boots in the dirt. I was wondering if you needed help. With the business, I could learn. I could work. I know I didn't." He trailed off. Clara looked at him, her brother who had taken everything and given nothing, who had laughed while she stood in the parking lot with a deed in her pocket and $1,200 less than she'd started with. She thought about the nights in the truck bed, the blisters, the broken shovels, the water seeping through clay like blood from a wound, the first bar of soap, the first bottle sold, the first time she'd looked in the mirror and seen someone other than a failure looking back. Before Clara answers him, "Real quick, would you have forgiven your brother after everything he did? Comment yes or no. I read every single comment, and I want to know what you would have done in her place." "I don't need help," she said. Her voice was gentle. It was not cruel, it was simply true. "I have help. I have good people. And I built this alone, Marcus. I built it because I had to, because nobody believed I could, not even me some days." Marcus nodded. His eyes were red. "Can I at least see the spring? The thing everyone talks about? The water coming up through the clay?" Clara considered this. Then she opened the gate. She walked him down the path she'd worn into the earth, with 1,000 footsteps, past the sheds where her employees waved, past the greenhouse, to the spring box. The water emerged from the clay wall in a steady, silent flow, clear as glass, cold as stone. It filled the catchment and overflowed into the pond, where the heron lifted off in a slow, majestic beat of wings. Marcus knelt and touched the water. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he stood, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything. For the truck, for the money, for laughing." "I'm sorry, Clara." Clara looked at the spring, at the clay, at the land that had been called worthless and had turned out to be priceless. She thought about forgiveness, about the difference between justice and cruelty, about the work it took to turn mockery into respect. "I know," she said. "But sorry doesn't build springs, Marcus. And it doesn't unbreak trust. You want to know what I learned out here? I learned that some ground looks dead because it's protecting something alive. And some people look weak because they're carrying something heavy. The clay wasn't worthless. It was a seal. And I wasn't a joke. I was just sealed off, waiting for the right pressure." She walked him back to his truck. He didn't ask for money again. He didn't ask for a job. He just sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at the farm through the windshield. And then he drove away. Clara watched until the Silverado disappeared down County Road 437, the same road she'd walked alone a year before with a deed in her pocket, and nothing else. She went back to work. There were orders to fill, clay to process, water to test, plants to tend. The sun moved across the sky, and the spring flowed. And the earth that had been called solid and dead continued to bleed water. Clear, cold, ancient water that had waited thousands of years for someone stubborn enough to dig, patient enough to listen, and brave enough to believe that what the world called worthless might simply be misunderstood. That night, Clara sat on her porch and watched the stars emerge, brighter than ever, unobstructed by doubt. The coyotes called, the pond rippled, and somewhere in the darkness, water moved through clay, rising, always rising, against every expectation, against every verdict, against every voice that had ever said it was impossible. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She simply sat with the land that had chosen her, and she listened to the sound of the earth bleeding life into a world that had forgotten how to look for it.